Good evening, and welcome to the final lecture by Professor Don S. Browning in his series, Psychology, Spirituality, and Psychotherapy, Toward a Revived Religious Humanism. The lecture series is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology in the Danielsen Institute, under a grant by the Meta-Nexus Institute of the Templeton Foundation. I'm Robert Neville, the director of the Danielsen Institute and professor of philosophy, religion, and theology at Boston University. Don Browning is the Alexander Campbell Professor Emeritus of Ethics and the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he himself took the PhD. Professor Browning is the author of a great many books and articles. His book, A Fundamental Practical Theology, defined that field for our time, as Schleiermacher did for his time. He's written on the interface of psychology, spirituality, and theology since the beginning of his career, and the topic of these lectures has been a lifelong interest. Most recently, he has developed collaborative research in religious matters to a high art, completing a well-funded, multidisciplinary project on the family. The collaborative project at Boston University, of which this lecture series is a part, owes much to Don Browning by way of precept and example. Professor Browning's lectures have or soon will be placed on the internet and can be accessed through Boston University's BU Universe or through the Danielsen Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology. 3 lectures were given in October. Yesterday, he presented lectures entitled Religion, Science, and the New Spirituality, and Mental Health and Spirituality, their institutional embodiments. He now is about to bring his series to a conclusion, moving from the practical considerations of his initial presentation through theoretical examinations of the hermeneutics of spirituality, psychology, and psychotherapy, back to the practical aspects of the therapy, the law, and religion. Practice, theory, practice. Someone should make something of that phrase. Please join me in welcoming Professor Don Browning to the lecture on institutional ethics and families, therapy, law, and religion.
Well, I want to thank you for the hospitality extended by the Danielsen Institute and this enterprise, and the opportunity to, as I've indicated before, kind of review some things I've said over the years, think about the present, think about the future, and bring some things together for my own purposes. So, the lecture is titled, if I can get my glasses out so I can actually read the title, Institutional Ethics and Families, Therapy, Law, and Religion. Now, I must apologize because I'm going to summarize some things in the first 2 or 3 pages that some of you have already heard, but it's the last lecture and not everybody has heard all these things, and I think they're kind of vital for the argument that I'm developing in this lecture. In the course of these lectures, institutional aspects of the science-religion dialogue have become increasingly salient. This is especially true for the dialogue between psychology, psychotherapy, and religion because of the direct cultural and social impact of each of these practices and disciplines. We first touched the importance of institutions in Kwame Apia's response to the emphasis by the leading moral psychologists Joshua Green and Jonathan Haidt on the priority of moral intuitions in contrast to moral deliberation as emphasized by Kant and the utilitarian John Stuart Mill. Apia acknowledged that spontaneous moral intuitions about pleasure, pain, danger, and safety, purity and disgust, and in-group versus out-group may be basic to our moral responses, but he does not rule out a rule, a place, and a role for moral deliberations. To be honest, neither do psychologists Green and Haidt. Rather, they relegate deliberation to impersonal moral decisions pertaining to public policy or larger groups rather than personal moral decisions where we live most of the time, and this is where our moral intuitions, these deep moral intuitions, tend to take over from their perspective. These moral psychologists also claim that these different moral responses are located and controlled by different parts of the brain. In acknowledging the possible truth of these observations, Appia, as we have seen, goes one step further and suggests such insights really argue for the importance of institutions. Institutions, I take it, that have been established by long-term deliberative processes by groups that have been tested over time and also help guide both personal and public decisions. This is close, as I've observed, to Ricoeur's understanding of the important role of inherited classic practices. Practices should be understood as institutional practices as well as personal practices. Appia's astute observation suggests to me that there may be more room for models of moral reflection associated with the cognitive theories of Lawrence Kohlberg and the closely associated discourse ethics of Jürgen Habermas than the work of Green and Haidt seem to imply. Of course, in view of recent advances in understanding the role of emotions in ethics and morality, the reigning model of moral thinking for the future will be what is called a mixed deontological model of the kind not fully found in either Kohlberg or Habermas, because they tend to disregard the role of emotions in their cognitive perspective. These are models of moral thinking that emphasize the priority of emotional intuitions toward the pre-moral goods of life, as we saw in Frankena, Janssens, and Ricoeur, but are finally organized by both our higher deliberative capacities as well as more tested traditions of moral deliberation, generally taking the form of inherited but evolving institutional patterns. The second place the institutional question emerged was in our discussion of psychiatry yesterday and its relationship to other institutions, especially religious institutions. I argued, for those of you who were here, the need of a public philosophy for psychiatry that would help orchestrate its relation to other institutions, such as law, the non-medical mental health professions, and spirituality, in both its more free-floating and institutional forms. A public philosophy for psychiatry would have both clinical implications for how religion is treated and cultural implications for how psychiatry is perceived by the larger society and its capacity to cooperate with other institutions. This lecture will carry the discussion further. I will now apply it to the specialty in both psychiatry and other mental health disciplines, the practices of family and marriage psychotherapy and counseling, and the relationship of these practices to the institutional embodiment of family law. American psychotherapy and counseling have been criticized for promoting an individualistic ethic of personal satisfaction and variously defined understandings of individual fulfillment. Robert Bellah, Christopher Lasch, more recently Frank Richardson, Blaine Fowers, and Charles Gagnon have all advanced this criticism. You've heard me summarize this material before. I've been part of this critique as well, as I confessed in earlier lectures. All these analyses, including my own, have been cultural reviews of the therapies based primarily on written texts of their principal leaders. It should be acknowledged that even though this is one way to grasp the cultural implications of these movements, this does not get to the self-image of individual therapists about the moral meaning of their work, nor does it capture what is actually done in the counseling process, which may not be nearly as individualistic as these critics have said. Finally, the cultural critiques, for the most part, lumped all the psychotherapies together, failing to make simple distinctions between individual therapy in contrast to marriage and family counseling and therapy. From 1991 to 2003, I directed at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago the Religion, Culture, and Family Project, which was generously funded by a series of grants from the Division of Religion of the Lilly Endowment. We produced 2 series of books and a PBS documentary called Marriage, just a piece of paper that showed on stations throughout the country during the spring of 2002. But we also conducted 2 empirical studies pertaining to the family field. I want to tell you about one of them. During the mid-90s, I joined with colleagues in family therapy and a statistician to execute a major national survey of the ethical commitments of marriage and family counselor therapists. It reached publication in the professional journal Family Relations. We sent the survey to 2,500 marriage and family therapists who identify themselves as members of one or more of 5 professional organizations: the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the National Association of Social Workers, and the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. We got back 1,035 completed surveys, a robust 41% of the original mailing, with responses fairly evenly divided between the 5 professions. The punchline of the results of this survey should not be too surprising, but they do correct a prevailing image held in many circles about the individualistic, maybe even ethical egoist goals of modern psychotherapies. Marriage and family therapists and counselors hold a more communal, relational, and traditional set of values about the purposes of their work that is implied in the critiques of Bella, Lash, Richardson, and the early work of yours truly. They hold less individualistic views than the official professional code of ethics of all of these organizations, codes that tend to emphasize Kantian-like respect for the dignity and autonomy of individual counselees over all other values. Although there is no universally shared ethic among these therapists, there is a dominant ethic shared by a significant portion of counselors and psychotherapists, an ethic that, if brought forth and systematized, could form the outlines of a public philosophy for this specialty of therapy and counseling. It could help dispel misconceptions of the mental health disciplines, at least in this area of family and couples work. It could orchestrate their work with other institutional sectors of society, especially the religious sphere, but as we will soon see, the sphere of family law as well. According to the small number of professional articles that have existed on the ethical sensibilities of marriage and family therapists, proposals about an adequate ethic have oscillated in this literature between individualistic or autonomy-oriented ethics and a systems view that emphasizes the good of the family group as a whole over the good of the individual within the family. Neither of these views seem quite accurate when compared to the self-understanding of the 1,000+ respondents to our survey. A significant portion seem to hold an ethic that we called an ethic of relationality, the ethic that emphasized affection and empathy between family members that both respects and meets the needs of individuals, as well as fostering mutuality and justice between all family members. We saw this ethic at several points in the responses we received to our survey. When we asked therapists about what they held to be the good moral life, 40% answered creating and fostering loving and caring relations, followed by 23% for another highly relational value, and I might add, the somewhat deontological principle of the golden rule, acting toward others as you would ideally wish them to act toward you. These answers trumped, by far, more individualistic formulations of the good moral life, such as being true to one's unfolding potential of one's inner self and increasing the good of the individual self without directly harming another, which respectively yielded 14% and 5% of the responses. Low on the totem pole was the divine command formulation that good moral life was a matter of following the will of a higher power. And the thought to be popular utilitarian, doing the most for the largest number of people, only got 2.1% of a favorable response. It is interesting to note that at this more abstract level of a general ethic toward life, there is little difference in the responses of male and female therapists. When we ask more concretely what was the purpose of families, the two relational choices of families are for mutual support and practical helpfulness, got 54%, and families are for friendship and sharing, got 17%, constituting a whopping 71% of the total. The choice families are for having and socializing children was third, and overall 19%, with more men therapists, 22%, than women therapists, 14%, affirming that purpose is central to what families are about. Once again, the idea that families are for individual members came in last at 6% of the respondents. The more concrete the questions got, the more surprising the answers. When we ask, are some family forms more health promoting for children? 58% said yes, and 41% said no. But this somewhat conservative sounding response got larger when we asked some additional questions. Of those therapists who thought family form made a difference for children, 70% thought, now get ready for this, that the traditional working father and mother at home with children was superior to other forms and patterns. This was followed by the two-income husband-wife nuclear family that got 25%. And blended families, single parents, and gay and lesbian couples got 2%, 1.7%, and 1.1% respectively among these nationally polled family therapists from 5 different professions. On divorce, 61% said that they were, in their therapeutic practice, neutral on divorce and did what is best from a therapeutic point of view. But this was quickly followed by a significant 33% who said they were committed to preserving marriage and avoiding divorce whenever possible. Only 2.4% would admit that they often recommend divorce when it is psychologically best for the individuals. There is much more in the report, but you have doubtless had enough statistics for right now and probably have a taste for why it contrasts with some of the overly broad cultural analyses of the individualistic ethical implications of the psychotherapies. In fact, some of the commonalities in ethics among these diverse groups of family therapists may contain the nuggets of a public philosophy for this loose consortium of mental health specialists. In addition, there are implications in this report for the larger normative themes running through these lectures. Remember, I've said that the science-religion dialogue may have the function of reviving a religious humanism. I've tried to illustrate this with comments about Christian humanism. This study also may have implications for this idea. One issue that I have discussed, and I did so in Lecture 2, was the definition of Christian love and the relative validity of the competing agapic, caritas, and eros views. Influenced in part by current contemporary social neuroscience and moral psychology, I built the case, you recall, for a strong role of affections in ethics and morality, tempered by an ethic of equal regard. I ended by arguing for the superiority of the caritas model. The emphasis upon affection, empathy, and mutuality in marriage and family therapist ethics is one more example of how the science-religion conversation can help revive a Christian humanism as well as give more prominence to the Caritas view of Christian love. In light of the ethical options competing in family therapy, the relational view is closer to Caritas than are either the ethic of individualism or the strong system ethic that subordinates individual needs to the health of the family as a whole. Caritas, as you recall, builds on our natural affections, especially for offspring, even as it gradually extends these affections to others. This survey helps soften charges against the modern therapies that they err in the direction of an ethic of individualism. But an ethic of relationality can give rise to its own misunderstandings. It may be seen to overemphasize process, affection, and communication in contrast to deeper bioeconomic functions of families as well as religious elements of blessing and covenant. Remember that having and socializing children was relatively low in these therapist lists of the purpose of families. This may possibly contradict their rather strong views that not all family forms are equal for the good of children, and that families with traditional bread earner fathers and stay-at-home mothers are best for child rearing than the dual income nuclear family arrangement and other alternatives. There's a lack of attention by family therapists to bioeconomic factors, what I've called falling Ricoeur and his theory of symbolism and archaeology of human motivation, does not correspond to the preoccupations of the rest of the social sciences, let alone the history of marriage and family in the great traditions, including Christianity. The relation of families and marriage to child well-being, poverty, health, and general wholeness are dominant concerns of both of these traditions of inquiry. The social science disciplines of economics, sociology, and biology, and, on the other hand, the great religious traditions. In these lectures, we first ran into the more bioeconomic view in reference to social neuroscientist John Cacioppo in Lecture 2. Building on the work of William Hamilton's theory of inclusive fitness and Robert Treffer's views on the biology of parental investment, Cacioppo has advanced the hypothesis well-grounded in evolutionary theory that motives toward inclusive fitness and kin altruism are the core of human intergenerational care and the vital link between sociality and spirituality. According to Cacioppo, this is because to live on in our offspring requires not only that we have children, but that our children have children. For this to happen, there must be a great deal of long-term investment by parents, extended family, and the wider community, thereby building a web of sociality that binds human intergenerational community together. This long period of human infantile dependence, in contrast to other species, is the key that pressures humans to form both long-lasting marital unions and supporting communities to assure that offspring endure. The second time we ran across this pattern of thinking, which in many ways is quite different from the relational model, even the communal relational model that we've found among the marriage and family therapists, was in the positive psychology of Jonathan Haidt, who repeated Cacioppo's line of argument almost exactly, with no reference, however, to him. This only shows how widespread this form of thinking is for those disciplines who draw on evolutionary theory. As you recall, Haidt's thoughts on these matters emerged in his discussion of happiness and how important attachments are to happiness. As you would expect, the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth have been important resources for Haidt's thinking, But then he went a step further. He agrees with Cacioppo and many other evolutionary thinkers that it's the large brains and heads of human infants leading to their early birth, a long period of helplessness that binds human fathers and mothers together in ways not found among other species. As Haidt says, this accounts for why a universal feature of human cultures is that men and women form relationships intended to last for years, that constrain their sexual behavior in some way and institutionalize their ties to children and to each other. Then there was a third time that you heard this bioeconomic archaeology of the institution of marriage. It came, surprisingly, as you recall, from the 13th century Roman Catholic Thomas Aquinas, when he wrote, "There are animals whose offsprings are able to seek food immediately after birth or are sufficiently fed by their mother, and in these there are no tie between male and female. Whereas in those offsprings needing the support of both parents, although for a short time, there is a certain tie, as may be seen in certain birds. In man, however, since the child needs the parent's care for a long time, there is a very great tie between male and female, to which tie even the generic nature inclines." So to work out their mutual and long-term inclusive fitness, the attachment of human beings to their highly dependent infants and children becomes central, so important that family formation has included, at the human level, the male in the mother-infant dialogue. Haidt then adds another wrinkle, one quite familiar to both individual and family therapists, and one turned, I might add, into a therapeutic empire in the School of Imago Therapy founded by Harville Hendricks. This is the insight that humans, in contrast to other species, recapitulate their parent-child attachments, avoidant, secure, or ambivalent, to use the refinements of Ainsworth, into their relationships with their mates. Patterns of childhood attachments become part of an intergenerational web of sociality that stretches throughout and perhaps beyond a single individual's human life cycle. But as we will soon see, the institutionalization of this web of attachments in family formation and marriage is very much at risk in modern societies. This is not just due to the dynamics of modernization, although these are certainly significant contributors. It is partially the consequence of a move in family law itself to deinstitutionalize marriage, a move that can be discussed without any reference to the controversial debates storming around the question of same-sex marriage. And the modern psychologies inform these movements depending upon which of its various schools of thought and research are taken seriously by contemporary legal theories. So the question of the institutional orchestration of law and family psychotherapy is the matter at stake in the discussion that follows. The dominant trend in family law theory today is what is toward what is commonly called the principle of private ordering. One can find this principle developed in a variety of prominent sources in family legal theory, such as the writings of Martha Ertman, Linda McLean, Daniel Friedman, the prestigious American Law Institute, sometimes referred to as OLLI, and its proposed reformulation of U.S. family law in its voluminous principles of the law of family dissolution. And you can also find it in the Canadian Law Commission's Beyond Conjugality. Private ordering means that law and society should support individual decisions of citizens in the area of sexuality, family formation, and procreation without the guidance and constraints of settled law. The assumption behind this idea is that individuals have the moral capacity and understanding to make good judgments about their needs and situation in the area of intimacy and procreation better and does government, legislators, and the law. The principle also implies that although law should do little to constrain private ordering, law and government should be willing to support its consequences with welfare grants and flexible legal provisions, handling the new challenges of child custody, definitions of legal parenthood, and visitation rights that are emerging from the increase of divorce, out-of-wedlock births, cohabitation, and the wider use by unmarried couples and singles of the advances of artificial reproductive technology. New respect in legal theory for the principle of private ordering expresses itself in a variety of proposals. In the American Law Institute's recommendations, it takes the form of total neglect of the law of family formation, while concentrating the resources of law and its courts primarily on the law of the dissolution of families. At the same time, the report, revealingly titled The Principles of the Law of Family Dissolution, renders cohabitation and marriage virtually equivalent before the law by applying marriage law to cohabitors when these couples break up. And in other words, if Ollie would have its way, you thought you weren't married, but at dissolution, you would find out that you might be married. Accommodation to private ordering also shows up in its interpretations to the best interest of the child in situations of family dissolution, in an effort to provide continuity for child and children in complex situations where the child may have a variety of caretakers and in fluid and informal family constellations. The principles would extend visitation rights and even legal parenthood to 3, 4, or potentially more adults in the child's life. Other interesting proposals are being advanced and championed. Emory University's legal scholar Martha Feynman recommends going further and delegalizing marriage completely. Marriage as such, or what she calls the sexual family, should be of no interest to the law. What requires legal involvement, support, and coercion, perhaps, are actual dependency cases. A single mother caring for her children, a middle-aged son or daughter caring for an elderly parent, 2 elderly sisters, or perhaps just friends who depend upon one another during moments of infirmity. These are the kinds of dependency arrangements, she contends, that today require the supports and benefits we once gave to marriage. Feynman contends that if married couples want the protections of law, they can develop private contracts, which courts could respect in times of conflict. If couples want the comforts of religious marriage, they can turn to the customary rituals of their respective religious traditions. But these ceremonies would have no status before the law as such. It's important for us not to lose track of the main point of my discussion. This is the point of institutional orchestration between marriage and family therapists and other institutions, in this case the law, which marriage and family therapists have individually or as a professional group thoughts about these proposed reforms. What would they think about other prominent recommendations? Take the interesting reforms advocated by June Carbone, a legal scholar at the University of Missouri. In her interesting book titled From Partners to Parents, Carbone does not go as far as Feynman in delegalizing or proposing to delegalize marriage, but she does believe that because of the extensive changes in sexual patterns in modern societies, marriage as an institution can no longer be relied upon to define and order the responsibilities of parenthood. According to her, defining and reinforcing parenthood should now become the main preoccupation of family law. Carbone's proposals to legally disconnect marriage and parenthood are summarized forcefully in the following quote. Early modern and Victorian society, she writes, provided for children through marriage. The marital link, which defined legitimacy, provided clear lines of connection and responsibility. And when marriage itself changed from an arranged affair to one based on choice, internalized gender roles served to link the voluntary institution to social obligations, chief among which were obligations to children. Lawrence Friedman's, a Stanford University law professor's, characterization of the contemporary situation under his phrase, the reigning republic of choice, that's what he thinks is basically guiding individual and even legal decisions, the republic of choice, provides no such automatic connections. Sex need not indicate openness to parenthood. Parenthood creates no obligations to marry. Marriage implies no particular organization for meeting the needs of children. That's their description of the emerging legal and social situation. Carbone proposes making parenthood, in contrast to marriage, the new status before the law, a status that replaced the privileges and responsibilities customarily enjoyed by giving marriage a special legal status. In the idea of status, the law means a predefined legal category that is not amenable to individual and contractual negotiations. Marriage historically has had many of these predefined characteristics which have granted it for society and the law the status of a status. Parenthood did too when it was tied to marriage. Now Carbone wants marriage to have the legal status independently of marriage. She writes, a family obligation is to be rebuilt on lines of status. Indeed, if it is to be rebuilt at all, in a way that links individual obligation to societal needs, then parenthood may be the only remaining candidate for status. Parenthood may play the part marriage once did of initiating young men and women into a socially sanctioned role, whether or not they would voluntarily embrace all of the role requirements. The doctrine of private ordering would be a bit more constrained in Carbone than would be in Feynman. It would not so easily be applied to parenthood, although it certainly would function to break the link between marriage and parenthood, even in her thinking. This may be enough to give you a taste of the direction of much of contemporary family law. And in a gradual way, a good deal of it is being enacted into legal statutes and court decisions even as we speak. These developments raise for marriage and family therapists not only the question of how they might respond to these trends, they also bring up the matter of how therapeutic theory itself has influenced and possibly encouraged these trends. There is some evidence that the ethic of relationality, as communally oriented as it is, that we reviewed earlier in this lecture, has contributed to the doctrine of private ordering and the possible deinstitutionalization of marriage. If what is really important is the relationship, why do we need the institution? If the relationship is solid between parents and between parent and child, why do we need the formal contract or covenant? And if the relationship is solid, then kin altruistic ties touted in evolutionary psychology may be secondary, if not irrelevant as well. The University of Chicago professor of social work, Froma Walsh, emphasizes relational process as a crucial factor in family health, not as biological or legal institutional status. In recent years, an entire field of psychology called close relationship theory has emerged and has had significant influence on both the sociology of family and theories of family law. Close relationship theory emphasizes the quality of the relationship rather than its institutional form. The Canadian Law Commission's report, Beyond Conjugality, which explicitly calls for law and public policy to recognize and support a great variety of close relationships and family-like groups beyond legal marriage, is substantially influenced by close relationship theory. The American Law Institute's principle of the law of family dissolution at one point explicitly states that legal marriage says little about the quality of relationship of the couple involved. And the quality of relationship seems to be, for the principles, what is really important. The emerging ethic of relationality, in spite of its avoidance of individualism, may be one of many factors influencing these new legal trends. Of course, you'll recall that in our survey, the ethics of relationality seemed to have a thicker, at times even conservative, spin to it that went beyond reflection and communicative process in themselves. Remember that 70% of family therapists who believed that family form counts for child well-being also held that the traditional working father and mother at home with children was the best arrangement for children, followed by 25% who thought that two-income husband-wife nuclear family was better than other alternatives. The survey wording of this second alternative between two-income families had married couples explicitly in mind and in the formulation of the question. And probably most respondents thought the first and most popular option assumed marriage as well. So there does appear to be an implicit interest in institutional form buried in the ethics of relationality found in the majority of respondents to our national survey of marriage and family therapists. This raises the larger question of public philosophy. Should this simultaneous interest in both relationality and institutional form found among these therapists gain formality and public articulation? This surprising interest in institutional form among many family therapists does not orchestrate well with trends in recent family law, but it does fit well with other dominant trends in the social sciences. In the last 15 years, there has been major developments in the fields of sociology and economics indicating that from the standpoint of the good of children, married and biologically related parents are, on average, the best for child well-being. The work of Sarah McClanahan, Paul Amato, Alan Booth, the Washington-based research firm called Child Trends, the Center for Disease Control, the University of Texas sociologist Norval Glenn, and Rutgers University sociologist David Popenoe all point in this direction. It's an interesting quirk of history that law has preferred to side with the rather slender strand of close relationship theory rather than the robust data of mainline sociologists and economists. This is probably true because law today fancies itself as morally neutral and also holds that the inevitable forces of modernization are simultaneously working to deinstitutionalize marriage and create what Anthony Giddens has called the quest for the pure relationship, an interpersonal relationship unencumbered by the burdens of either law or offspring. The dominant legal theories today are clearly both influenced by a disembodied ethic of relationality and interested in conforming to the dynamics of modernization, which it judges to be inevitable. There are, however, legal theories that are using social science insights into institutional theory to resist trends toward private ordering. Georgetown University legal scholar Milton Regan uses the social psychology of George Herbert Mead to argue that marriage as a legal institutional status must be retained because of the importance of what intimate relationships contribute to personal identity and mental health, as well as for the importance of structured institutions to pattern and to mediate these relationships. Regan's argument, however, has little to do with the needs of children and mainly addresses the requirements of adult psychosocial identity. With her other resources, they will help me illustrate the kind of dialogue that may need to proceed between law and psychology, including the specialty of marriage and family therapy. The writings of Notre Dame professor Margaret Brennick help illustrate the importance of institutional theory, both the biological and the economical aspects of it. Her writings also demonstrate the importance of a phenomenology of the inherited dominant model of marriage that has functioned in Western society, the model of marriage as covenant. Finally, her thoughts suggest ways that the modern disciplines can cooperate to revive a religious humanism that will serve to integrate science and religion into a more compatible relationship to one another without sacrificing their respective integrity. Brennick is both a legal scholar and an economist. Furthermore, she is a leading legal scholar today, supplementing her theories, her legal theories, with empirical research on issues in family law. She also is among a select group of family law theorists who address both the front door and the back door of family law, both family formation and marriage, as well as family dissolution. This twofold concern also has implications for understanding the best love, care, and interests of the child. Brennick's empirical research gives her family law scholarship a rich double language composed of the classical marriage concepts of covenant and one-flesh union and empirical data interpreted by the new institutional economics. Brennick opposes Feynman's desire to delegalize marriage. She opposes Carbon's interest in replacing legal marriage solely with law's support of parenthood. And she opposes the principles, the American Law Institute's principles for the law of family dissolution, concerned to make domestic partnerships functionally equivalent to legal marriage. On the other hand, she is realistic about the need to make provisions for the backdoor of family law, the law of family dissolution. For instance, she affirms, when possible, the good of keeping natural and legal parents involved with their children after divorce through some system of joint custody. Brennick preserves in fresh terms the accomplishments of the older Jewish and Christian jurisprudence on marriage and family, without, however, becoming narrowly apologetic for these religions as such. She does not directly present theological arguments for her case. On the other hand, her position is theologically sensitive. For example, it is consistent with the integrational model of care found in the classics on marriage and child care in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, to whom I have often referred in these lectures. Her position is a kind of legal version of what I have called religious, if not Christian, humanism. She advances her position by beginning with a step that could have been inspired by the hermeneutic phenomenology of Gadamer and Ricoeur, and their concern to anchor understanding by interpreting the classics shaping our effective history. She presents a phenomenology of covenant, a description of the cultural model of marriage that historically has dominated Western thinking in both law and religion. She then secondarily or diagnostically, to refer to Ricoeur's concept discussed in Lecture 1, and makes a use of both the new institutional economics and evolutionary psychology in ways analogous to how Aquinas used the psychobiology and institutional theory of Aristotle to shape Roman Catholic marriage theory and much of later Western legal tradition on marriage. She does this to illustrate how covenant thinking can be translated into secular law and secular law's rightful concern with the hard procreative, economic, and health realities of marriage and family in modern societies, in addition to the interpersonal relationship dimensions of this institution. Brennick argues that the dominant post-Enlightenment contractual model of marriage that sees it as a freely chosen agreement between husband and wife is inadequate to both our experience of marriage and our past legal understandings of the institution. Marriage, she insists, historically has been viewed as a solemn agreement to a union of unconditional love and permanence, through which the parties are bound not only to each other, but also to some third party, to God and the community, or both. This phenomenological description of the inherited normative understanding of marriage is not presented, as I've indicated, by Brennick as a confessional religious statement. It is rather simply a description of the culturally received meanings of marriage as the inherited dominant model. After she does this, she then gives a further economic account of its concrete institutional implications. To understand the social functions of covenant, Brennick turns to what is commonly called today the new institutional economics. This perspective both builds on yet goes beyond the rational choice view advocated by Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker. Marriage, she argues, is more like a firm than it is an individually negotiated economic contract. A firm is an association organized to perform specific functions, achieve economies of scale, capitalize on special talents of individual participants, and relate to external parties as a collective unit. A firm is based upon a prior agreement, something like a covenant, between the parties involved and the surrounding community about the purpose of the corporate unit. Brennick believes that the new institutional economics helps us see things in the firm and in marriages, especially marriages with children, that the older individualistic rational choice model set forth in Becker's Nobel Prize-winning treatise on the family. That's the name of the book, and what that book and his work often overlooked. It also helps us see aspects of family formation that the concept of private ordering and its theory of implicit contracts misses as well. Understanding of marriage in analogy to firms enable us to grasp the channeling, signaling, and reputational aspects of firm-like marriages. The firm model reveals how marriages formed by public and settled public commitments, that is, covenants, between the couple, the potential children, and the wider society, develop identifiable social patterns that convey trusted information, dependable access to known goods, and valued reputations both within the marriage and between it and the larger community. Once again, this is a point similar to the one we saw Ricoeur developing in his theory of practices set forth in the second lecture. Marriage that results in children, however, are more like a particular type of firm that Brennick calls franchises. Franchises have developed predefined arrays of valuable goods, obligations, and services that individual managers consent to and agree to serve. A set of imposed responsibilities come from marriage and children and from the outside expectations that cannot be totally dissolved, even, she says, with legal divorce. Brennick contends that the inextricable one-flesh union and shared family history do not disappear when marriage ends or a child becomes 18. Brennick points out something that the ancient one-flesh model of marriage profoundly understood, but the modern scholars such as Martha Feynman miss, that divorcing couples never completely revert to the pre-marriage state. nor do children leaving home at maturity free themselves entirely from their parents or siblings. Brennick's twofold phenomenology and institutional economic analysis of the marital conflicts leads her to say marriage persists to a certain degree in spite of divorce. To the extent that it persists, the family still lives on in what I call the franchise. Brennick's position is supported by empirical research she did with the University of Virginia sociologist Stephen Knock. Their findings are based upon the University of Michigan panel survey of income dynamics and its child development supplement. They analyzed the large longitudinal data based on these surveys with standard social science scales measuring child well-being, keeping children with natural mothers, both married and unmarried, constant. They measure child well-being from the perspective of variables of income, family structure, the legal relationship of parents, which is the novel new thing they're measuring here, parental warmth, close to Feynman's nurturous model, and mother's race and age. All of these factors counted positively in some way for child well-being. But in contrast to the major trend of contemporary family law theory, as exhibited by Feynman, Carbone, and the principles, legal marriage and family structure count the most for child well-being. In contrast to much of contemporary family law theory, they found evidence that demonstrated that the status of parents in legal marriage is a leading asset for the well-being of children. Family form is also a plus. Children, on average, do better on a host of indices when raised by their own two biological parents in legal marriage. As is widely believed in the social sciences and law, income contributes to child well-being, especially to in the child's earlier years. In the long run, however, Brennick's empirical research shows income is not as important as either legal marital status or the parents or family form. Finally, her research shows that Feynman's emphasis on the mother's love, or Carbone and the principles advocacy of parental and caregiver continuity also count, but not as much as marital status of parents and family form. Both covenant theory and institutional economics give Brennick and Knock an explanation for this importance of legal marriage to child well-being. They write that when legally married couples know they are in a long-term relationship until death do us part, or at least until the age of emancipation, they have incentive to specifically invest in the relationship and in the other party to it. In addition, quoting them, legal recognition provides a signal for the provision of all kinds of outside support for the family, whether by government, by extended family, or by other affinity groups. These investments and subsequent benefits accrue to the children as well as the adults. Brennick's phenomenology and economics analysis of covenant. In this phenomenology and economic analysis of covenants, we have a view of marriage that meets the rationality test of legal theory. It is both influenced by and broadly compatible with the outlines of the integrative view of marriage and parenting found in the Jewish and Christian humanistic traditions, and probably in most of the other traditions as well. Hence, it would help bridge the social space between secular law and the dominant models of marriage and family traditionally functioning in American culture. Her work might also give and serve as a stimulus to a more intelligent conversation between marriage and family therapists and family law theorists. It might help both sides clarify their public philosophies and orchestrate their work to other institutional realities in our society. I feature the work of Brennick and her associate Stephen Knock not to indicate that they're the only figures in contemporary family law moving toward a more adequate understanding of the institution of family and the best love and interest of children. There are others, but they do merit serious consideration and thoughtful analysis by both family therapists and family law scholars. Her writings help illustrate the kind of interdisciplinary work I envision that must go into a revised religious humanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Browning. Now begins our traditional question and answer period. We have a microphone that is for recording purposes only, so if you have a question, if you could wait for me to bring the microphone to you before you begin. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you. This was fascinating. I appreciate it. Close relationship theory is having an effect on law, you said, on family law theory.
Yeah, I gave two examples of it. It's clearly important, very important in Canadian trends. It's invoked as the major social science resource that, for all practical purposes, is already accomplished. And that a spread of marriage provisions to a wider range of dependency groups. Based upon the idea that it's the quality of the relationship that's really important, and the dependency needs that are being met, and not the marital covenant and contract as such. So marriage hasn't disappeared, it's just, as you might say, broadened. And they may not call it marriage, but all the benefits and provisions and protections, and many of them, I should say, have been spread. In other words, in that framework, marriage becomes a form of social service welfare. And instead of supporting people through other avenues, you support them through extension of marital privileges. Now, this has not happened in the United States on the ground, but it's clearly a part of the American Law Institute's principles of family dissolution, of the law of family dissolution. They too would say it's the quality that's important. And that's another sign that close relationship theory is having its impact at that theoretical level. That report came out in 2002. Here we are, 2008. It's had a tougher ride in getting into state legislatures into concrete law. But there's no agency in American intellectual legal life more powerful and respected than the American Law Institute. So when they come out with a big report, it's about 2,000 pages, it's going to be taken seriously. So yeah, it's there.
Well, that's happening. The citizens of California voted for a constitutional amendment to define marriage as one man and one woman. It seems that if you ask intellectual law geeks the way things should be with families, you get a very different answer than when you ask the general public what a family should be. Could you comment on this?
Well, these intellectual traditions, see, as you notice, I didn't even mention same-sex marriage. I knew that somebody in the audience would. Because in some ways that is a detail within the larger frameworks of shift. And I find the larger frameworks of shift more interesting because they touch more things. But there's hardly any doubt that legal theory is drifting in the direction of two things: the extension of marriage as a form of social welfare to all kinds of groups. Now you take, well, Linda McLean is a friend of mine. She just joined your law faculty here. She came up from Hofstra about 2 years ago. Now she would be in this group that would want a broadened registration system that would give you all kinds of marriage-like privileges if you're in a situation of dependency. So the expansion of marriage as a form of welfare, or the delegalization of marriage are two broad trends, and they're very prominent in law schools. Legal scholars and judges and lawyers are going to be schooled in this way, and we're thinking in ways the general public is not, and the general public doesn't even know what's going on. Now, that remark doesn't mean it's all bad or all good. I'm just kind of being descriptive as to where the intellectual currents are.
Here in Massachusetts, we've had debates about marriage and the difference between marriage and civil unions. And reflecting on the vocabulary that you've introduced tonight, I think the people who say civil unions are enough would be the ones who would say that it's the relationships that you need to protect. Whereas those who say that there's that we need same-sex couples need the institution of marriage would say that there's a much richer, deeper, symbolic institution that goes along with the distinctions that you were drawing there. Do you see any difficulty with that latter argument? That is, doesn't that go along with your general defense?
Well, it depends upon, two directions. Most of the arguments, as I see it right now, are about whether or not the extension of marriage to same-sex couples changes the definition of marriage. And some people say it is precisely moves it toward a close relationship theory. Is what some people would argue, in contrast to that thicker bioeconomic theory that I also outlined. It's very complex because clearly marriage, either way you look at it, has got to be seen as a close relationship. I mean, I'm not out to get rid of that, and in fact, I'm not out to even concentrate on the issue of same-sex marriage. I'm just saying that there's a broader discussion that it's interesting for you to pay attention to, that raises all kinds of additional issues that are worth, and then locating that particular discussion in these larger trends may be fruitful.
I'd like to ask a question that relates less to what you were saying tonight than what you said last night and really in the lectures as a whole. It seems to me you're the perfect resource to answer this question. It seems to me that for a long time, historians have tended to exaggerate the role of secular psychotherapy in 20th century America and to minimize the role of pastoral counseling. In fact, if we view pastoral counseling as a form of psychotherapy, it seems to me we could argue that when we're talking about psychotherapy in America, for most of American history, what we really ought to be talking about is not Freudianism and not some other form of secular psychotherapy, but pastoral counseling. Would you comment on that?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, two sources here. I think whatever else you think of Michel Foucault, he understood that modern psychiatry was a secularization and redoing of certain aspects that came from the religious traditions of counseling and confession. Another great source for this is the work of Brooks Hollifield, specifically on the American traditions. So these are massive traditions on the ground doing a piece of work. And they're part of what I would hope you could take out of what I've said in these lectures here and also in my other writings. There's strong intellectual grounds for the work of pastoral psychotherapists and counselors to bring a psychodynamic archaeology to the work, a better understanding of human motivations and development, to a context that may have continuity with the value and symbolic frameworks of a particular religious tradition. And Talcott Parsons saw that, I think, brilliantly. that the pastoral psychotherapist provided both continuity and distance. And the distance is valuable, the continuity is valuable, and so yes, and there are some very good reasons, as long as pastoral psychotherapists get a little distance from their own confessional tradition and don't shove it down the throat prematurely to their clients, that can be a plus for stabilizing the assumed value structure that guides the therapy and the counseling. And many people go to pastoral counselors because they want that kind of settled, and they want to be able to concentrate on the other static that's going on, the developmental static and other conflicts that are going on. So historians, I think, probably have neglected that. Do you have any particular historians in mind on that?
Well, I think the whole Philip Reef tradition, I think most people who deal with the history of psychotherapy tend to ignore the centrality of pastoral counseling in the psychotherapeutic set of strategies. Yeah. If I were going to name the group that had most to do with psychotherapy on the ground, it would probably be the average clergyman in small-town America. I think another thing that people tend to overlook is, especially when you're talking about Freudian psychology, for example, well, you know, Freudian analysis is urban-oriented, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, and I think that people have really exaggerated the degree to which that's made a difference in very many Americans' lives. Many Americans, I think, are a lot more inclined to be willing to talk to their pastor about these things than they are some secular psychotherapist.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I don't know whether you've seen Arnie Goldberg's last book. I have an endorsement on the back of it he asked me to do. Arnie Goldberg is a very, very well-respected analyst and author in Chicago, and I know that Chris knows him. And it explicitly addresses the moral dimension of psychoanalysis. And but basically, he said the task of the analyst is to keep analyzing it, never to affirm it, never to even bracket it and let it be there for a while, but it relentlessly analyze how it's functioning in a person's life without exception. Now, I happen to know that one of the leading theologians of our nation is now under analysis with Arnie Goldberg. I'm looking to see how it all turns out. Because Arnie's got one thing: analyze those moral commitments, analyze those theological commitments, analyze, never deviate. That's the role.
One of the increasingly common family arrangements is a married couple, man and woman, with the woman being the breadwinner and the man being a stay-at-home primary caregiver for the children. Does any of the research you talked about tonight address the health of the children?
This was done, approximately 10 years ago. And of course, the arrangement you're talking about now is more prominent and more visible now than it was then. So we didn't have questions on that, and they didn't have any responses on it. I was just, if anybody knows the religion and culture and family work, we're all promoting the dual income mother-father relationship with the idea, though, the society has to make several concessions, structural concessions, to develop the social systemic possibilities for a genuine equal regard family in both work and both the public life and the private life. So that's where we were putting our eggs. So for these therapists to come back and say, well, no, the best thing for children, is the working father and the stay-at-home mother, I was really, really surprised. But I think you had to believe that that was kind of where they were, because we had 5 professions, good sampling from these 5 professions. I mean, this was a surprisingly good sample, all my social science colleagues tell me. And so when you come up with those kinds of responses, you've got to kind of take it seriously that these counselors have some ideas you didn't expect them to have.
Is that a self-selection
Could well be. Could well be. Who knows? I can't, that's the thing about surveys, you can't get behind those things and get an answer.
I'm wondering, you mentioned at the end about a dialogue or some kind of a synthesis between those who, assume, particularly in marriage and family counseling, the importance of the traditional family model and the legal direction of marital law. Practically, how do you begin the dialogue, or who takes the initiation on this? Because it seems
right here. We begin the dialogue right here.
Okay. All right. Okay.
You write books and articles and discuss, and that's kind of where it is. No, I've been through some conferences where these things are beginning to develop. One of the strange twists in my life is I've been spending quite a little bit of time with legal types and writing in legal journals and contributing to symposia and things like that. And the dialogue's beginning. But the legal profession is very smart people, very smart scholars that primarily talk to themselves. They borrow materials from, increasingly they're interdisciplinary, but they don't get involved in interdisciplinary teams. They just take a little here and take a little bit there. So increasingly, the rest of society, for good and ill, there's some good stuff going on there, I think some things that are less good, need to get in conversation with a relatively isolated and autonomous discipline. There was strong legal theories. Legal positivism was all about law's autonomy. You accept that premise, and you don't need to talk to anybody else because nobody else can help you get your grounding. Law's autonomous discipline. That was a dominant perspective for many years, less so now. And so very smart people, very well worth talking to, but a relatively isolated discipline. But of course, I was just trying to illustrate this as if you took our survey and you brought those 1,035 people in here and I read them this paper, I think one thing they'd have to admit that some of their assumptions about the settled legal background that they could more or less assume as operative in the marriage and family field is sliding off in some other direction. That raises really interesting questions in marriage and family counseling, I would think.
We have any other questions? All right, I just want to remind you that we have refreshments right through the doors, so I invite you to continue the conversation with Dr. Browning afterwards. And we have some closing remarks from the director.
I want to thank you all for coming to this and to these the previous lectures. This has been an extraordinary exemplification of how one's mind needs to be changed to get involved with learning from other disciplines. So my applause to you, and will you join me in thanking Don Browning for this extraordinary set of lectures.